from OECD Trade and Agricultural Directorate. We look forward to your presentation on transparency, characteristics, and environmental effects of industrial subsidies. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting us to present some of what we do on the question of industrial subsidies. We have some slides. I'm just going to wait to see if they can be uploaded on the screen. I'll start with a brief series of 6 slides, and then I'll pass it over to my colleague Grégoire Garçou next to me, who will discuss some work he's been doing on steel and aluminum subsidies. I'll start by asking a sort of a rhetorical question. What is a green subsidy? Personally, I don't know. There's a useful way to think about that. Maybe the simplistic way that most people view it is that if it's a subsidy for a green sector, like solar panels or wind turbines, it's green by essence. And if it's a subsidy for brown sector, it's dirty by essence or harmful for the environment. I think the reality is a bit more complicated. I can think of subsidies that are targeted at so-called green sectors, but are bad for the environment. If you subsidize coal for producing solar-grade polysilicon, I'm not sure it's such a great thing for the environment. But if you subsidize the deployment of solar modules, that's probably a good thing. The same way in brown sectors like steel making, if you increase capacity for blast furnaces that are coal-based, that's probably bad. But if you subsidize those furnaces so that they convert to hydrogen or electric arc furnace, it's probably better for the environment, relatively speaking. So it's a bit complex. To take a concrete example, I don't want to pick on any one country, but I'll just take an example from what I've been reading in the papers lately. There are discussions in the UK about what's going to happen to the Port Talbot steel furnace in Wales. Some say we should subsidize the furnace so that it stays in activity because that's one of the last remaining furnaces in the UK. Others are saying we should subsidize it to convert it to an electric arc furnace, which will recycle steel, which will be less energy intensive and less polluting. That's an ongoing debate, but it shows you that it's not easy to understand what is green. Like, is converting that to electric arc furnace green, even though it's still producing steel and still using a lot of energy? I don't know. But what I know is that the fact that we're able to discuss this situation is because the UK is transparent about its subsidies, and not everyone is. We just discussed the issue of notifications and the efforts that are put in place to increase notifications, including by low-income countries that may not have the capacity to do so. But I would argue it's not just a problem notifications in the WTO, it's also a domestic problem in countries with higher incomes. A lot of countries that are middle income or high income do not have very accessible portals online for knowing about their subsidies. I mean, I can think of 2 examples that are great. There's the usspending.gov at the federal level, which gives you all grants and loans from the federal government to all companies in the US. I can think, of course, of the EU state aid mechanism, but that's all I can think of in terms of easy to access portals where information is available to the public. Now it gets even worse when it comes to subnational jurisdictions, because a lot of the action is happening there. But what noted earlier when we discussed the case of US and China notifications, a lot of it is subnational, and it can be very difficult to know what happens in individual municipalities or counties and so on and so forth. The problem is that this lack of data has really harmed the research and empirical assessments of subsidies and their environmental implications. That's different from what we have in agriculture, in fisheries, or even fossil fuels, where we're starting to know a lot more about what's happening. So this has enabled a lot of assessments and studies over whether some agricultural subsidies are green or not, whether they're input-based, output-based, decoupled. That's a long-standing stream of work. Nothing of the sort exists for manufacturing because we don't have good data. And without data, there cannot be any good analysis. What's more, what makes this even worse for manufacturing is that a lot of the support measures are very complex in nature. One key factor in this complexity is because some of the support is not coming directly from the government, but is coming from state enterprises that are acting on behalf of the government or as agents of the government. So here's an example looking at a hypothetical example of an electric utility that's state-owned and providing cheap power to an industrial user, the orange one on the right. That industrial user may also be getting all sorts of subsidies like grants, tax breaks, cheap loans from state banks. But here it's also getting cheap electricity from a state-owned electric utility. that state-owned electric utility is getting cheap feedstock like natural gas or coal from another state-owned provider of these gas or coal. They might also be getting cheap loans from state banks. And then you have the governments intervening at different stages of that chain to basically inject capital into loss-making companies or regulate the prices at which they can sell and buy and so on and so forth. So it's a very complex picture. And we've seen concrete real-world examples of that sort of situation. The problem is when you're dealing with this, the whole issue of transparency becomes much more difficult and quantification becomes really difficult. You have basically a supply chain of not just manufacturing stages, but also subsidies at different stages of that chain and different actors involved at different layers of governments. It's useful in this perspective to not just think of subsidies as discrete measures you can notify and identify, but also as flows of money, as money to be tracked across entities, across stages of a chain, and even across borders sometimes. So with this in mind, what we're trying to do at the OECD is to build a different picture of manufacturing subsidies from the ground up. So we look at individual companies in different manufacturing sectors, the biggest ones that together account, say, for 2/3 of global sales in their respective sectors. And we try to understand everything they're getting from all levels of government. So it's a bit like dredging the bottom of the sea and trying to see what you catch in your net as you fish. That's a terrible, actually, metaphor because that's clearly an environmentally harmful subsidy. But you see what I mean. Like we're trying to catch things from the bottom up. And what we get in our nets are very interesting things. So here's some of our latest data that cover the whole period 2005 to 2022 and about 500 firms over that whole period by sector. The first thing I would note is that when you accumulate grants, tax breaks, and cheap loans, and you express them as a share of firm revenue, so as a percentage of the sales of the firms getting the subsidies, you find that solar panels, the manufacturing of solar cells and solar modules, has been the most subsidized sector relative to its size over the past 18 years. I bet that's not what you had in mind. Another thing to note is semiconductors at number 3. That's less of a surprise. I mean, we're hearing about semiconductor subsidies every day now in the press. What I would point your attention to as well is the cluster of energy-intensive heavy industries with aluminum, shipbuilding, steel, and cement, which are also in the top sectors relative to their size. That's interesting, that's important, and we'll get back to that with Grégoire in a minute. There are other kinds of subsidies which were missing here because they're harder to quantify, they're harder to track. We've made some efforts at the OECD to try to quantify some of them, but our sample is much less representative and complete as it is now here. So when it comes to cheap energy inputs subsidized by, like I said, state electric utilities or state providers of gas and electricity, we've tried to quantify that for a few companies, 33 of them in cement, steel, aluminum, fertilizers, and chemicals. And this can be pretty significant. On the left is the absolute amount in millions of dollars for that illustrative sample of 33 firms. So yes, 33 firms, and you get almost $20 billion in some years. So that's a lot. And on the right, we've expressed those subsidized energy inputs as a share of what firms are actually paying in terms of their energy bills. And what's interesting is you can see that the natural gas subsidies are basically sometimes in the highest estimates, 500% of their energy bills. So in other words, they're paying only a tiny fraction of what they should be paying if they were buying their energy inputs at market prices. I'll conclude now and leave Grégoire to do the rest of this presentation. But I'll end by saying that we really need more information on the scope and scale of industrial subsidies. We have work ongoing on a database called MAGIC that we hope will further improve the situation and provide more insights in coming months and years. But much more remains to be done by everyone to understand what it all means for policy. Future work at OECD should provide these answers, and I think Grégoire has some elements of these answers that he will show now.
Thank you, Jean, and good afternoon, everyone. So what I will do now is to discuss the findings from a report in which we use the database that Jean just alluded to or just explained, this firm level database in which he finds a lot of granular information. And so we use this database in a report in which we try to address the climate implications of government support with a focus on the aluminum and steel industries. So the motivation for this report is that, in theory, government support to industries can have two opposite effects on emissions, and that echoes Jean's first slide on about the fact that we don't really know what are green subsidies, because it ultimately depends on the effects they have. And so they can have two opposite effects. On the one hand, government support could decrease emissions through well-designed support measures that would contribute to the development and the adoption of new climate technologies, and that would and these technologies would thereby overcome technology market failures. That is a suboptimal amount of climate technologies in the economy. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, government support can also increase emissions because this support can allow inefficient firms to produce industrial output that would be above levels that would otherwise be determined under market conditions. And that would generate an excessive amount of emissions. Now, which of these two effects prevail is an empirical question that we set to explore empirically, therefore, in this report. So we decided to focus on two relevant industrial sectors, which are aluminum smelting and steel making, and this is so for two reasons. The first reason is that these two sectors are carbon intensive. They account for 2% and 10% of global carbon emissions respectively, which is sizable. And the second reason is that, as Jean already explained, they receive large amounts of government support for which we have pretty good data. Thanks to the work of Jean and his team. So. All right, I will now present the main findings of the report. In the interest of time, I will present only the results for aluminum, but the same are found for the steel industry. Okay, so the first finding of the report is that emissions in the aluminum industry have increased by more than 100% between 2006 and 2022, which is our period of observation. And if we look at the drivers, what we see is that this increase has mostly been accounted by a scale effect. So the volume of the aluminum production has increased, and therefore emissions have increased. But that is not all. Increase in emission in the aluminum industry has also been explained by what we can call a composition effect. That is, less efficient firms have taken over market shares at the expense of more efficient firms, and that has resulted in more emissions. Now, what we also observe, and that's a pretty good news, is that there was a technique effect that tended to decrease emissions. So that's the black bar that you see on that chart. So technologies to produce aluminum on average have improved, and aluminum could be produced with less emissions. So as I said, that's a pretty good news. Now, the not so good news is that this technique effect is very small and is completely offset by the scale effect and the composition effect. Now, the question that we really want to answer in this report is, to what extent did government support contribute to these three effects? Did it contribute to the composition effect, to the technique effect, or to the scale effect? And what I'm going to do now for the next few minutes is to try to provide element of answers to these questions with some data visualization. Sorry. All right, so I will start with the scale effect. So what this graph shows is the production of two groups of firms over time. The first group of firms receive big amount of government support, and we call them major recipients of government support, and this is the orange line that you see on the graph. And the second group of firms receive a smaller amount of government support. So what we directly see from the graph is that the firms that receive more government support have grown much faster than firms that received less government support. And therefore, it suggests that government support allows firms to grow more than under market conditions. And by growing more, firms generate more emissions. And in that sense, the government support received by firms would have contributed to the scale effect of emissions in the sector. Now, turning to the composition effect, here we have another graph that shows a ranking of firms by their emissions intensity. So their ton of CO2 emitted per ton of aluminum produced. Again, the firms are divided by whether they received a big amount of government support or small amount. And what we see quite strikingly is that firms that received more government support are most emissions intensive, are the most emission intensive ones, or in other words, the least efficient ones. And so because they have grown faster, as we saw in the previous slide, well, automatically they have taken over market shares at the expense of more efficient firms. And this shows that government support has contributed to modify the composition of the market. So that's the composition effect. And this composition effect has contributed to increase emissions in the aluminum industry. Now, turning to the technique effect, again, we have a graph that shows the firm's emissions intensity, but this time we see its evolution over time. And what we see is that all firms have improved their emissions intensity over time, but firms that have received less government support, the blue line, have improved more than firms that have received more government support. So again, this is pretty good news. Like the aluminum industry has been improving their techniques over time. But what those results suggest is that government support did not play a role in these technology improvements, which resulted in decreased emission in the industry. So this is already my last slide. To sum up, what I can say is that, and what we find in the report is that government support contributed to increased emissions from aluminum and steel making activities, mainly through an increase in production output, but also by moving production from more to less efficient plants. And what we also find in the report is that government support did not play a role in the development of techniques that enabled a better environmental performance. So I just want to make a very important parenthesis here. Throughout this presentation, I just showed a few charts that illustrate these findings, but in the report, these results are derived from a very robust econometric analysis. Yeah, there is a strong quantitative analysis that supports these results. Okay, and another point that I would like to make is that the report also shows that if government support is removed, and we made some simulations, again, quantitative simulations on it, we would observe that global output will decrease, but global emissions will decrease even more. And that means, or at least that suggests, that subsidy reform could potentially be a cost-efficient climate policy to reduce emissions. Okay, so to conclude, I would just say that, yeah, another important point is that the bottom line of these findings is not that government support is necessarily bad for the environment, but what it shows is that up until now, The government support that has been provided to firms in the aluminum and steel sectors did not translate into emissions reduction. And quite the opposite, it has actually contributed to increase emissions in these sectors. So the policy implications, I think, are that these results should be part of the discussions on how to design packages on green industrial policies. Yes, industries need subsidies to decarbonize, but we should not ignore that the same industry already received subsidies that may go counter this objective, as these results demonstrate. And I will stop here. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Jérôme and Grégoire, for that presentation. Before opening the floor for questions, let's move to the fourth presentation by the IM.